All right, so part 4 of the endocrine system. This is our last video lecture. You can see our topics for this video. We're continuing with the adrenal hormones, but talking specifically with the adrenal cortex and the release of aldosterone and cortisol. We'll also discuss adipocyte hormones and pancreatic hormones. So, thinking back to the adrenal cortex, we learned that this structure will release 3 classes of hormones. First one being androgens, so sex hormones. The next one being mineralocorticoids, which is aldosterone, and then glucocorticoids, which is going to be cortisol, which we'll talk about next. So when talking about aldosterone, we first have to remember, where does this secretion originate? Think back to when we learned about the POMC peptides. We learned about melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. And MSH is secreted primarily by the pituitary gland, and it stimulates the release of aldosterone in the adrenal cortex. So that's where this secretion originates. We have to have MSH signal its release from the cortex. So let's look at the primary roles. So we see regulating water balance and electrolytes, signaling the kidneys to retain sodium and secrete potassium, and then increase blood pressure and volume, causing water retention. So this hormone is essential for sodium conservation in the kidneys, salivary glands, and sweat glands. It plays a role in homeostatic regulation of blood pressure, plasma sodium, and potassium levels. It does so primarily by acting on the mineralocorticoid receptors in the distal tubules and collecting ducts of the kidneys. It also influences the acid-base balance in the body. It regulates hydrogen ions and increases intercellular buffers in the body. We learned about intercellular buffers such as sodium bicarbonate and other proteins that can buffer away hydrogen and other associated acidity. So aldosterone also plays a role in that. It also helps to stimulate the release of arginine vasopressin. So another name for this is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. On the next slide, we'll learn about ADH, arginine vasopressin, but let's first look at this graph at the bottom. So this shows exercise and then the percent change in a certain group of hormones. So first at the bottom, we see percent VO2 max. So that's referring to exercise intensity, aerobic exercise intensity, starting very low and then slowly increasing that percent all the way up to 80. We notice there's a pretty positive linear change in aldosterone, which we see as these blue squares. See, they are increasing. But let's also look at these other two. So we have renin activity and then angiotensin 2. So there's a system called the renin angiotensin aldosterone system, and it's a hormone system that regulates blood pressure and fluid and electrolyte balance in the body. So let's first start with renin. So renin is an enzyme secreted by and stored in the kidneys, which promotes the production of a protein, angiotensin. So renin's primary function is to eventually cause an increase in blood pressure, leading to the restoration of perfusion pressure in the kidneys. Angiotensin 2 is a peptide hormone that causes vasoconstriction and an increase in blood pressure. Angiotensin also stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex to promote sodium retention by the kidneys. We'll look at this system a little bit more closely on the next few slides, but what I want you to grab from this graph here is just basically that as intensity of exercise increases, aldosterone also increases, and it's due to the increased renin and then angiotensin release. Aldosterone is especially important in exercise settings where fluid and electrolytes kind of pose a challenge to the body. Resistance training does not present a challenge to water balance, so we don't see an increase in these hormones and proteins with resistance training. We mainly see it with endurance training. especially outdoors in hot and humid environments where we need to conserve our water and electrolytes. Endurance training does improve aldosterone response at maximal intensities. So the more trained you are, you're going to have a better kind of aldosterone release to kind of help regulate water balance. But let's kind of continue with antidiuretic hormone, which is also referred to as arginine vasopressin. So antidiuretic hormone is made by the hypothalamus in the brain, but it's stored in the posterior pituitary gland, which I have kind of shown in this kind of title. It tells your kidneys basically how much water to conserve. ADH constantly regulates and balances the amount of water in our blood. Higher water conservation increases volume and the pressure of your blood. So let's look at some of our factors here. So we see reduced water loss from the body to maintain plasma volume of the blood. Release is stimulated by high plasma osmolarity and low plasma volume. This is due to sweat loss during exercise without water replacement. So ADH is a chemical produced in the brain that causes the kidneys to release less water. So it decreases your urine produced or urine output. High ADH level causes the body to produce less urine, and a low level results in greater urine production if you don't have ADH. Let's talk about high plasma osmolarity and what that means. So plasma osmolarity measures the body's electrolyte water balance. There are several methods for arriving at the quantity through measurements or calculations of our plasma, but osmolarity is basically a measure that refers to the concentration of dissolved particles of chemicals and minerals such as sodium and electrolytes in your serum. So high plasma osmolarity means there are more particles in your serum, where low plasma or low osmolarity means it's more diluted. So high plasma osmolarity, we've got more sodium, electrolytes, and other substances in our serum. Low plasma volume means there's less of the watery component of our blood. So what would happen when would this happen? Just like it says here, if we're exercising and we're sweating, and we're not replacing our fluids. So most of the time when we exercise, we're constantly sipping on fluid. But if we don't do that, our urine gets very concentrated, where we have kind of like a high amount of solutes without much solvent. And that causes dehydration due to the loss of water. So antidiuretic will try to hold on to our water to prevent any further dehydration. When is this hormone released, or what causes it to be released? We already know it's related to aldosterone, but we can see with exercise, it's going to increase with intensities greater than 60% of VO2 max to maintain our plasma volume. Again, the watery component of our blood. So we see here percent change in plasma ADH, so the ADH in our blood. And then we see as we're at rest, we see it stays relatively low, and it also stays low even around 50%. And then after about 50 to 60%, we see a pretty steadily decline in ADH. This again just kind of helps prevent dehydration and loss of water from the body to maintain plasma volume. Let's move on to what I mentioned earlier with the aldosterone, renin, and angiotensin system. So like I mentioned earlier, the name of the system is down here at the bottom of the screen. It's a system that regulates blood pressure and fluid and electrolyte balance in the body. So the release of aldosterone, we know, is stimulated by MSH, but it's also stimulated by increased plasma potassium levels. So what does it mean when there's increased plasma potassium? High potassium levels is called hyperkalemia. It's an electrolyte balance indicated by high levels of potassium in the blood. Potassium, as we know, is an electrolyte. Normal levels of potassium are important for maintenance of the heart and nervous system function. One way our body regulates blood potassium levels is by shifting potassium in and out of the cells. But when there's a breakdown or a destruction of cells, electrolyte potassium moves inside the cell to outside of the cell wall. This shift of potassium outside of the cells causes hyperkalemia. Potassium is usually excreted by our kidneys, so flushed out of our system. But any damage to our kidneys or when they're not working properly may cause increased potassium levels, leading to hyperkalemia. So aldosterone will be released to stimulate the secretion of potassium. And it also stimulates sodium and water reabsorption from the gut, the salivary and sweat glands in exchange for the loss of potassium. So let's talk about this next part right here. So we see decrease, and then again, PV is plasma volume and or blood pressure at the kidneys, or an increase in sympathetic nerve activities to the kidney stimulates renin. All right, so let's explain this big picture here and try to follow all of these arrows. So there is a lot to discuss, so kind of let's look at what's going on here. So let's start over here with our aldosterone. So aldosterone, we know it's released by the adrenal glands, and it impacts the kidneys specifically, which we already know about the functions of trying to maintain water balance and regulate electrolytes. So with aldosterone being or kind of impacting the kidneys, basically when renal blood flow is reduced, the kidneys will produce renin. And we see here is our renin, which renin is an enzyme. Renin will be directly excreted or secreted into circulation. Plasma renin, so now that it's in our blood, then carries out the conversion of angiotensinogen, which we see here, which is produced by the liver. So renin will act on angiotensinogen, which is a protein produced by the liver, and it will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then sent to the lungs, where this other enzyme, we see angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, will convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, and we see that right here. So ACE, this enzyme where my pointer is found on the surface of the vascular endothelial cells, predominantly of those in the lungs. So it's just a converting enzyme. So converting one of our proteins here, angiotensin 1, into angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2, where my cursor is a potent vasoconstriction peptide that causes blood vessels to narrow, resulting in that increased blood pressure. So let's look here. How does that work? Angiotensin 2, we already know, will impact or stimulate the cortex to also release aldosterone, which will have a direct effect on the arteries. We see here vasoconstriction, just like I mentioned. So vasoconstriction causes increased blood pressure because now these veins or these arteries are smaller, and it'll impact the heart as well to result again in that increased blood pressure. So if those arteries, those veins are smaller and there's more blood being pumped through, that causes resistance. So if there's a resistance, we're going to have an increase in pressure. We also see that the kidneys can directly cause increased blood pressure due to sodium and water retention. So now we have greater blood volume, and if there's more blood volume, there's more blood being pumped through a fixed space, again increasing the pressure. So that's the basics of the system. I know that was a lot, so you can always go back, rewind this video, replay it to gather what I said about each one of these enzymes, proteins, and hormones. Also just know, how does this system respond to exercise? It's increased. It's increased because there's water loss, and so now the body is trying to hold on to extra water in the body, so it decreases urine output, and then we also have an increased pressure. So this video here will kind of explain this system a little bit better.
Now, changes in effective circulating volume are detected by low-pressure baroreceptors, which are located in the pulmonary arteries, venous atrial junction, the right and left atrium, and the right and left ventricles. Decreases in effective circulating volume activate these low-pressure receptors, whose fibers activate sympathetic fibers located in the medullary cardiovascular center. These sympathetic fibers innervate the hypothalamus, as well as smooth muscle cells that surround the afferent and efferent arterioles, and granular cells located near the afferent arteriole. Sympathetic activation of the hypothalamus activates the thirst response as well as the secretion of arginine vasopressin, or AVP, from the posterior pituitary, which helps restore effective circulating volume by increasing water reabsorption along the collecting duct. Likewise, sympathetic activation of smooth muscle cells reduces renal blood flow and glomerular filtration rate, which in turn helps restore effective circulating volume by reducing the rate of water excretion. Finally, sympathetic activation of the granular cells stimulates the secretion of renin, which does two things. First, it promotes an increase in arterial tone, which helps restore blood pressure, and second, it promotes the reabsorption of sodium along the collecting duct, which helps restore effective circulating volume by increasing the driving forces for water reabsorption by the kidneys. I should mention that while sympathetic activation of granular cells is the most prominent factor in the secretion of renin, it's not the only factor. For example, a reduction in renal perfusion pressure, which is detected by baroreceptors in the afferent arteriole, also stimulates renin release, as well as a reduction in the sodium chloride delivery to the macula densa cells. Now, once renin is released, it immediately converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin I, which is then immediately converted into angiotensin II by the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE for short. As you advance along your education, you'll hear a lot about drugs that inhibit ACE and how they commonly are used to treat hypertension and congestive heart failure. This is because they block the production of angiotensin II, which, under normal conditions, helps restore effective circulating volume by promoting renal sodium reabsorption and systemic vasoconstriction. First, angiotensin II promotes sodium reabsorption in a number of ways. However, it's the direct stimulation of aldosterone release that is the most prominent and talked about. It starts when angiotensin II binds G-protein-coupled receptors, which activates a calcium-dependent exocytosis of aldosterone-containing vesicles from the glomerulosa cells of the adrenal cortex. Circulating aldosterone then diffuses into collecting duct principal cells across the lipid membrane because it's a steroid hormone. Inside principal cells, aldosterone binds the mineralocorticoid receptor, which then translocates into the nucleus and binds promoter elements of aldosterone-regulated genes. This leads to the synthesis of new epithelial sodium channels, or ENaC, as well as enzymes that regulate ENaC activity. This in turn leads to the insertion of more ENaC channels into the apical membrane and the activation of these and existing ENaC channels, which increases sodium reabsorption along the collecting duct. This in turn increases the osmotic driving force for water reabsorption, which helps restore effective circulating volume.
All right, so that was a lot of information, I know, but that was just supplementary. This is what you need to know is just mainly this slide right here and what I mentioned earlier. That video was just to give you a little bit more information. All right, let's move on to the next hormone released from the adrenal cortex, which is cortisol. All right, so next is cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid. You have to remember, where did that stimulation come from? And we see release is stimulated from the pituitary gland. If you remember ACTH, I would normally ask you, remember, what does this stand for? It stands for adrenocorticotropin hormone. So adrenocorticotropin will stimulate the release of cortisol from the cortex due to stress. So physiological bodily stress, ACTH will activate the adrenal gland, cortisol is produced. What are the main roles of cortisol? So we see maintains plasma glucose during fasting and exercise. We'll look at the circadian rhythm of cortisol on the next slide, and we'll talk about how it's released in the morning. So cortisol is very high in the morning, and if you think about it, we just woke up from an overnight fast. So it maintains glucose levels when we're fasted. So when we wake up in the morning, we haven't consumed anything since dinner the night before. So we're in a small fast. So cortisol levels will increase. And then also during exercise, when the body starts using blood sugar, so using plasma glucose for energy, cortisol also increases to help maintain those glucose levels. And we know cortisol is released during stressful times. It also stimulates free fatty acid mobilization from adipose tissue. So I've highlighted this red square right here, rectangle. We see cortisol. It affects adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. So it will break down triglycerides into a free fatty acid and a glycerol molecule. So what happens from here? We follow the arrow for the FFA, so the free fatty acid, and it increases fatty acid oxidation, meaning it prefers to use fat for fuel. So it uses fat for fuel due to the breakdown of triglycerides. What happens to glycerol here? So glycerol we see will be sent to the liver to undergo gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source. So it takes amino acids and glycerol and turns it into glucose. And then it sends glucose back into the blood, again, going back to maintaining plasma glucose levels. And then it also will mobilize amino acids. And we just talked about the gluconeogenesis process. It will take muscle and it actually will break down protein. So it takes muscle, breaks down protein, turns the protein into the amino acid strands, and then the amino acids are also sent to the liver to undergo gluconeogenesis. So taking amino acids and glycerol to make more glucose to be circulated in the blood. So we look at this dotted kind of channel right here, and it shows that glucose will stay in the blood. But the next part here, look at this purple box, it blocks entry of glucose into the cells. So it permits glucose from being used by the cells. It prefers to use the fatty acids instead. So this is actually a good thing for fat loss because it permits glucose, so sugars, from being used, and it breaks down fat instead. But it's the bad thing because there's a bad relationship because primary catabolic hormone in the body. Catabolic hormone means a breakdown hormone. So this part here, the blue, where it takes muscle and breaks down our protein into amino acids for fuel, that's the negative aspect of cortisol. That's why it's the primary catabolic hormone. It stimulates prolytic enzymes, which are enzymes that break down protein into amino acid. We don't want this to happen. We want to keep our protein stores. We want to keep our muscle stores. So that's the only downside of cortisol, is that it is catabolic and it breaks down our protein stores. So why does it do this? Basically, the body wants more glucose when cortisol is high. So it's taking the amino acids and the glycerol and it's making more glucose for our blood. So what's the purpose of this? Conserving glucose needed for the brain and the nervous system during stress. Because cortisol is only high during stressful times. So if we're stressed, it means our brain and our nervous system need more energy. So that's where the glucose is going. It's not used by our muscle tissues. It's used by the brain and the nervous system. So let me just kind of read you a statement from a research article that I looked at. So because most bodily cells have cortisol receptors, it does affect many different functions of the body. So other processes that cortisol can influence is controlling blood sugar levels, regulating metabolism. It also plays a role in reducing inflammation. It assists with memory formation as well. It has a controlling effect on salt and water balance and helps to control blood pressure. It does function to increase blood sugar through gluconeogenesis, to suppress the immune system, and then aid in metabolism of fat, protein, carbohydrates. It also decreases bone formation. That's the other downside where the catabolic part comes in. I think on the next slide, we'll talk about how cortisol acts during exercise. So this slide here is just to look at the main roles. Here is the circadian pattern for cortisol. So plasma cortisol levels in the blood. So you can see that we have 150, nanomoles per liter of cortisol just at rest and during sleep. So during sleep, as we start sleep, but as the night goes on and it transitions to morning and we start to wake up, you see that cortisol skyrockets while kind of right when we wake up. One reason is due to being in a fasted state. We said cortisol increases. And another reason is to kind of wake us up for the day. So to wake us up for the day, to get us out of bed, get us moving. For a lot of us in the morning, when we're in school, we've got to get ready to go to an early morning class or get ready for a workout. So it's just kind of preparing the body for the day. And then you see we're going to eat breakfast. We'll probably consume something between the 8 to 12 hour time, and cortisol will drop back down when we've consumed food. And then as we kind of go through the afternoon, let's say we haven't consumed anything between lunch and dinner, we may see another little spike in cortisol. And then once we've consumed a lunch or a snack, we may see another drop, and then it increases again when we're fasted. So yeah, this is just kind of the natural pattern of cortisol throughout the day. It kind of has a pulsatile release, so tiny little spikes throughout the day just to kind of keep us alert and awake. Next, let's talk about its role with exercise. So resistance training and aerobic exercise has been shown to increase cortisol levels. So resistance training will increase cortisol levels if of high volume and high intensities with short rest periods. This protocol is going to stimulate cortisol due to that stressful environment, especially when there's a short rest break. The body is going to be under kind of constant stress as you move through your resistance workout. But looking at high intensity endurance exercise, it's been shown greater than 70% of VO2. What this shows down here, I read this study, and this was 15-minute run at 85% VO2 max. So just a very short run. And during this time, we see just a pretty high spike in cortisol, and then it will slowly lower back down. So remember, cortisol is released in response to stress, which would be exercise. Also sympathetic stimulation, which also occurs during exercise, with low blood sugar and dropping glucose after an overnight fast or during exercise without consuming food or fuel. And it peaks in between meals when blood sugar starts to drop, and then before lunch or dinner. It will decrease after a meal and at night to promote better quality of sleep. It also decreases after exercise to promote recovery. But yeah, that's all we have kind of about cortisol, but I normally would ask this one question right here. There's something called Cushing syndrome or Cushing disease. So if you don't know it, I'll explain it right now. Cushing syndrome is a condition that occurs from exposure to high cortisol levels over a long period of time. The most common cause of this is use of steroid drugs, but it can also occur from overproduction of cortisol by the adrenal glands. It has some pretty bad side effects like fatty humps between the shoulders, a rounded face, pink and purple stretch marks, excessive sweating, abnormal weight gain, anxiety, depression, hair loss, so just a lot of bad stuff. But what the definition is just mainly when the body produces too much cortisol for a long period of time. But that's all about the adrenal glands. Let's move on to adipocyte hormones. Okay, so adipocyte tissue, it is an endocrine organ that secretes numerous protein hormones, including leptin and then adiponectin. So here's each of those. These hormones generally influence energy metabolism, which is of great interest to understanding the treatment of type 2 diabetes and obesity, which we'll talk about. All right, so starting with leptin, we see that it influences appetite through the hypothalamus. So how does it do this? It regulates energy balance by inhibiting hunger, so telling your body that it does not want any food. In turn, this will diminish fat stores in the adipocytes. So leptin will act on cell receptors in the hypothalamus. Although the regulation of fat stores is deemed to be the primary function of leptin, it also plays a role in some other physiological processes. It also regulates energy balance and is released during exercise to stimulate appetite or decrease appetite. We also see that it enhances insulin sensitivity, which refers to how sensitive the body's cells are in response to insulin. So high insulin sensitivity allows the cells of the body to use glucose more effectively, reducing blood sugar. And it also enhances fatty acid oxidation, so meaning free fatty acids are used for fuel. Adiponectin is the next adipocyte hormone, and you can see it has the same roles as leptin does, so increasing insulin sensitivity and improving fatty acid oxidation. So its main roles are glucose regulation and then oxidation of fats. It's secreted from the adipose tissue and then also from the placenta during pregnancy. It's secreted into the bloodstream, and it's very abundant in the plasma relative to many other hormones. Another fact is it increases with caloric restriction. So circulating adiponectin concentrations are higher when the body is restricted of calories, such as patients with anorexia nervosa. This actually is surprising for researchers because adiponectin is produced by fat tissue. So if restricting calories, that results in a loss of body fat, but that's where this hormone is produced. So now let's talk about with increased fat mass and obesity, what happens to each of these hormones. So if you read below that statement, we're looking at higher leptin levels and lower adiponectin levels with obesity. So how does this happen? Obese people usually have unusually high levels of leptin compared to normal-sized people of a healthy BMI. This is because some obese people, the brain does not respond to leptin, so they keep eating adequate or excessive amounts despite high volume of fat stores. This is called leptin resistance. It's when the brain doesn't recognize the high levels of leptin. But leptin is trying to tell your body that it's full and it does not want any more food. So that's why an obese person would have higher levels of leptin, is because their body isn't recognizing that they're full, and so the brain keeps secreting, or the fat keeps secreting leptin, but there's leptin resistance going on, so the person keeps eating because their body can't recognize it. It's basically the leptin cannot attach to its receptor, and if it can't attach to the receptor, then it cannot cause an effect inside the cell, which causes the fat cells to produce even more leptin, resulting in those higher levels. Adiponectin is going to be lower with those with higher body fat. Why is this? Again, we said that it increases with caloric restriction, so without food, where with obesity we know there has to be a presence of high amount of calories, which would reduce the adiponectin levels. But as weight loss starts to occur, adiponectin levels begin to increase. Adiponectin is also known for its anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity. Therefore, if we have increased fat mass leading to type 2 diabetes and obesity, we're going to have low-grade inflammation because there's lower adiponectin and we have less of an anti-inflammatory response. So that's basically what you need to know for adipocyte hormones, is just understanding leptin and then adiponectin and the roles they each play with obesity. But next we're moving on to pancreatic hormones, and this will be our last topic. All right, so the pancreas is located in the upper abdomen near the small intestine. We have multiple pancreatic hormones that we'll discuss, but we see pancreas releases digestive enzymes that neutralize stomach acid and break down macronutrients in the digestive tract. These hormones or these enzymes play a role, or they have a role in antibiotic properties of insulin, the regulation of blood glucose, and a role in diabetic processes as well. So we have to understand that the pancreas contains these specialized isolate cells that secrete glucagon and insulin. And we'll look at 4 isolate cells in the pancreas. So first is beta cells. These cells will secrete insulin to lower blood glucose levels when high. The beta cells constitute about 60 to 80% of the cells in the pancreas. We already know the role of insulin, uptake and storage of glucose and free fatty acids. We know with exercise, plasma concentrations of insulin will decrease, so decreased insulin response following training. So beta cells will secrete insulin during times of food consumption to lower blood glucose levels. So anytime there's high levels of glucose in the body, we need beta cells so we can have a decreased blood sugar. Next is alpha cells. These consist of about 15 to 20% of the cells in the pancreas. So what alpha cells do is they secrete glucagon to increase blood sugar when low. So basically the opposite of the beta cells. Glucagon works to raise glucose concentration in the blood if it falls too low, such as during exercise. This would cause the liver to convert glycogen into glucose for more energy. So the alpha cells will secrete glucagon, increasing our blood glucose levels. So during a fast, so we wake up and we haven't consumed any food, so during a fast or during exercise when our body is using blood glucose for energy. Next is delta cells. Delta cells secrete somatostatin to inhibit the release of insulin and glucagon. So somatostatin will inhibit any insulin from further being released from the beta cells, or and also inhibits glucagon from being released from the alpha cells. So delta cells are about 5 to 10% of the cells in the pancreas, and these cells just basically maintain blood sugar. So they don't increase or decrease, they just keep our blood sugar where it is, so at a normal level. And then last are PP cells. So PP cells are pancreatic polypeptide cells, just like it says here. They secrete these polypeptides to inhibit the release of pancreatic juices. Only about 1% of the cells in our body, cells in the pancreas are PP cells. The maintenance of our pancreas and glucose, maintenance of glucose in the body is very tightly regulated unless you have a disease state. But what we see here is just the primary cells that regulate our pancreas. This is a classic endocrine feedback mechanism between the insulin and the glucagon together controlling our blood sugar, which, like I said, tightly regulated system. These cells also use negative feedback, and these hormones use negative feedback, so insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin. So if any of these hormones are too high in the blood, they would use negative feedback to act on these cells to stop secreting them. So how does exercise influence insulin and glucose in the blood? So this question will be answered on the next slide. So with exercise, we're going to see a drop in blood insulin levels. So as we're exercising, insulin's going to decrease because the blood sugar decreases. So what happens? This is going to stimulate the liver to release more glucose due to the breakdown of muscle glycogen. And this is when exercise is continuous. So continuous exercise, we're constantly using our blood sugar for energy. We need more glucose. So insulin's going to decrease when glucose drops. But as the liver starts to release more glucose, insulin's going to start to rise again to move that glucose into the cells. Also, with ingestion of carbohydrates and protein pre or post exercise, we see an increase in insulin. So this is going to impact blood sugar and increase insulin. This is where the role in muscle protein synthesis comes in. So insulin also has some anabolic properties. That anabolism is stimulated by that nutrient intake. So as we consume carbs or protein, insulin rises because now we have to move that glucose and those amino acids into the cells or into the muscle so we can use it for fuel. Insulin also works with amino acids by moving them into the muscle, which helps with muscle protein synthesis. So increased muscle building, hopefully resulting in hypertrophy. Last, let's talk about chronic exercise. So chronic high-intensity exercise training reduces insulin resistance and increases insulin sensitivity. So the target tissue becomes more sensitive to insulin's effects. And it also increases receptor binding. So increases the likelihood that insulin can bind to receptors. We see greater benefit of insulin action with increased exercise intensity compared to lower exercise intensities. So diabetics actually benefit from exercise because it increases insulin sensitivity with endurance and resistance training. So what we see in this graph right here, we see over time as exercise is 60 to 120 to 180 minutes of exercise, what happens? We see a steadily rise in glucose, so it's going to be low at first, but it's going to increase and then kind of level off with a slight decrease. That's because the liver is releasing more glucose for energy, and the muscles are using more glucose, so those levels are higher. We see insulin drop though. So exercise may decrease insulin without carb or protein ingestion, but glucose increases because the liver is breaking down more glycogen for energy. So with that insulin dropping, it's dropping because we haven't consumed any fuel and we're using our blood sugar. Another fact about resistance training, it's shown to improve muscle function and whole body insulin sensitivity. It stimulates glycogen metabolism and increases muscle protein synthesis, resulting in hypertrophy. So chronic exercise has shown to reverse metabolic syndrome seen with type 2 diabetes. So reversing metabolic issues and defects in the metabolism. All right, this video you see here at the bottom, it talks a little bit more about diabetes and the role of insulin, and you can watch that on your own if you're interested. But what you see right here is the last quiz review. The last quiz starts with chapter 2 all the way through chapter 8. So you'll have more questions, but it's still worth only 10 points. So you'll just have a lot of half-point questions. So this is your review. You can pause the video, take a picture of this, and be prepared to take that last quiz